Hey, good morning. Welcome to ECC. We've been going through the Bible this past year, kind of hitting some of the big points to really help us to understand what God is saying through the Bible. And last week we started a new portion of that where we're specifically talking about Moses and the courage that it takes to go through the Exodus. And Byron led us through the first portion of Moses' life. From his birth through his parents taking him and saying, there's something different about Moses. There's something special, and we don't want to throw him into the Nile because they were told they had to throw boy children into the Nile. So instead, they took him and they put him in a basket and they put him in the Nile, and he sailed down, and he gets rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and gets to spend the next 40 years living in the temple. Not at the temple, in the palace. He gets to spend the next 40 years of his life being the grandson of Pharaoh. He's adopted into their family. And I love how sometimes the Bible takes something like as big as 40 years, and they say something like this. One day, after Moses had grown up, that's a great way to take 40 years of living in the palace, 40 years of getting to do everything, of getting to order people around and doing that. 40 years summed up into one day after Moses had grown up. He went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And we read that and we think, what had to have happened for 40 years in the palace to be thrown away because you see an Egyptian beating one of your brothers and sisters, like one of your people? What had to have gone on in Moses' head to make him think, I'm going to give up living in the palace to go kill this Egyptian? And we get this idea, we get it from movies. Like if you watched The Prince of Egypt, which is one of my favorite movies. I love that movie. And I love just the way that it stays so close to the Bible. But there's this one part where Moses, like, all of a sudden discovers that he's not a Hebrew. Like, Moses didn't all of a sudden discover that he wasn't a Hebrew. It's very clear that Moses knew the whole time he wasn't a Hebrew. This is what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. See, I think Moses grew up his entire life knowing that he was adopted. He knew that he was a Hebrew. Let's not forget that the first several years of his life when he was being nursed by his own mother, and isn't it awesome how God works out, that they take Moses and they put him in the basket and send him down the river, and then Pharaoh's daughter discovers him, and then Moses' sister comes up and says, hey, do you want me to find somebody to help you nurse him? And God orchestrates this situation to where Moses' parents get to take care of him for the first several years of their life, and Pharaoh's daughter pays them to take care of their own son. Isn't it amazing the way God works these things out? And so I think Moses knew. I think Moses knew every day. He had that conversation with his mom. He knew he was a Hebrew, and he knew there was something special going on. That for 40 years in the palace, they treated him well, but he knew he was adopted. He'd probably heard the story of how he had been found. So I think Moses gets this idea that, hey, God has set me apart for something special. There's a reason why I'm in the palace. There's a reason why all these things have happened. And I think I get that because in Acts 7:25 it says, when Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they didn't. You see, he had this idea that God had designed him for a specific purpose. His purpose in life was to lead the people out of Egypt. And so he one day is walking and he sees the perfect opportunity. He sees one Egyptian out beating a Hebrew, and he looks around and there's nobody else. And he thinks to himself, this is my chance. This is my time. I'm going to go kill this Egyptian, and I'm going to bury him in the sand. And when I do this, all of the people are going to hear that I did this awesome and amazing thing, and they're going to want to follow me. I'm going to do this, and the people are going to want to follow me. He wants to become a relatable figure to the people. He wants them to not look at him as the Prince of Egypt. He wants them to look at him as a man willing to kill for them. Problem is, it doesn't work. How often do we try and do things on our own only to find them fail, but then we get to watch God do them awesome later? It says, in the next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." See, Moses thought that when he did this, the people were going to look at him and they were going to see the leader that they had been praying for. He thought, I'm going to kill this Egyptian and everybody's going to want to follow me. Everyone is going to want to do exactly what I tell them to do. But it's literally the next day he finds out that he's completely wrong. The next day he wakes up and tries to lead his people and says, "Hey, why are you beating on your fellow Hebrew? Like, what, are you going to kill me too?" I think this is Moses' oh crap moment. We all have those oh crap moments when we do something and we think it's going to work out a particular way, and then God was like, "No, I don't think so." And you're like, oh crap. This is that moment for Moses. I think you'd be able to watch the blood drain out of his face as he knows that his plans have now completely failed. And then we read in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So why did the people not want to follow him? I mean, he's just shown that he's willing to kill for them. Why do they not want to follow him? I believe they don't want to follow him because they're like, we don't know who you are. Dude, you've been living in the palace for 40 years. You haven't been down here with us making bricks. You haven't been down here with us working and slaving in the hot sun. You haven't been down here with us getting beaten. You haven't been in our homes when soldiers come to take our children and throw them into the Nile. You haven't been doing any of this. You spend all your time in the palace. We're not going to follow you. He had no street cred. They did not want to follow him at all. We also asked the question, why was Pharaoh so quick to turn on Moses? You notice he kills one Egyptian, and you'd think, okay, Pharaoh's going to like sweep this under the carpet, like, I don't want to get too political here, but do some stuff to make stuff go away and stuff like that. Let's do that politics stuff so that nothing happens. The next day, he finds out that Pharaoh wants to kill him, and he's trying to kill him. Why? Because I think this wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. I think Moses was probably that guy that at every family event was be like, "Hey, when are you going to free the slaves?" Like, "Hey, my people are still in slavery." When Moses goes and kills the Egyptian, I believe Pharaoh knew that Moses had picked his side. Moses had decided which side he was going to be on. He'd chosen to side with the Hebrews. Problem is, the Hebrews didn't choose to be with Moses. Every time I read this story, I'm reminded of, in Thor Ragnarok, there's this scene where Thor meets this guy named Korg, and he walks up to him and says, "Hey, they're in prison." And he walks up to Korg and he says, "Hey, what'd you do?" He goes, "Well, I tried to lead a revolt on my home planet, but I didn't print enough pamphlets, so nobody came." I believe Moses is at that point where like, man, I did what I was supposed to do. Where are you all? But the Israelites didn't want to follow him. Moses chose his side, and the Hebrews chose their side, and they didn't want to follow him. So he goes to Midian. And you notice that when he gets to Midian, the first place he goes is to a well. We read that a lot in Scripture, that when people are running, when people are doing things, and they need to be with other people, they go to where the other people are, and that's the well. Everyone has to come at some point during the day to get some water. So he goes to the well. While he's there, he meets some ladies that are coming, some shepherdesses that come down to take care of their flocks, and some other guys try to harass them, and so he does what any guy does in that situation. He sees a bunch of pretty girls getting mistreated. He steps up and beats the snot out of them and drives them off. They take him back to home. He meets Dad. Dad says, "Hey, I really appreciate this." He gets to marry into the family. This is a synopsis of the next 40 years of Moses' life. He gets to spend 40 years living in Midian, gets married, has a couple of kids, and spends the next 40 years in the wilderness as a shepherd. Can you imagine that if you're Moses, that you got to spend 40 years in the palace doing everything that you wanted to do? You tried to do what you thought God wanted you to do. And now you get to spend the next 40 years in the wilderness as a shepherd. You go from being able to order people around and to tell people to do exactly what you want them to do, to dealing with a bunch of stinky animals that don't pay attention to anything anybody tells them what to do. Then we read this. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help became, because of their slavery, went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of a fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, hey, I'm going to go over there and see this strange sight and why the bush doesn't burn up. See, Moses, I believe, is that one guy when you watch horror movies and there's the sound going on in the basement. Moses is the guy that walks up and opens the door and goes down to the basement. I'm the guy standing there goes, stop doing that, let's get out of the house. Moses is like, hey, there's a bush over there on fire, but it's not burning up. Let's go investigate. I'm the guy that says, hey, there's a bush over there on fire and it's not burning up. Let's go the other way. But Moses wants to go investigate. He goes to find out what's going on. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And I love this when we read this. And Moses said, here I am. I don't think that Moses, after walking over to a bush that's on fire that's not burning up, and here's God speaking to him from the bush, I don't think Moses' response was, here I am. I think Moses' response was, here I am. I think he was terrified. If you walked up to a bush that's burning and not on fire and it starts talking to you, is your first response to talk back to it? Mine is to run the other direction. But again, that wouldn't have happened because I would have already run the other direction. So while he's talking to God in the bush, God says, hey, you remember that job that you thought you were supposed to be doing? You're supposed to be doing it. I'm going to send you to Egypt to free my people. I'm going to send you to go do the job that you tried to do 40 years ago and failed. I'm going to send you to go do that job today. Now we think Moses hears this and Moses says, finally, it's finally happened. I've been called to do what I've been called to do in the first place. I'm going to go do this. No, Moses' response is, I don't think so. Moses' response is a response of fear. This is what we read. Well, I'm a little messed up, sorry. He has a fear-based objection. Objection number one is he says, I'm a nobody. He looks at them and says, you know what? He looks at God and says, I used to be in the palace. I used to be the prince of Egypt, and now I'm just a shepherd. I'm a nobody. He says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God says, I want you to go, and he says, but I'm nobody. Like, you can't send me because I used to be somebody, and now I'm nobody. I don't want to go. His second objection is, they won't believe me. I tried this once, and it failed. If I try it again, the people are going to listen to me, and they're not going to believe me. They're not going to believe that I've actually had this conversation with you and that you sent me here. They're going to think I'm trying to do it all on my own again. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I tell them? The whole point of this question is, listen, God, if I go and tell them that you told me to do this, they're going to ask who you are. What am I going to tell them? Who am I going to say actually sent me? We read it again in chapter 4. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to what I say? And they say, the Lord did not appear to you. He can't get over the fear of, I'm going to go tell them that you sent me, and they're not going to believe me. I've tried this before. It didn't work. The third objection that he comes with is, he says, I'm not a good communicator, which I think is interesting because we don't read that anywhere else. We don't read that Moses had a speech impediment or a stutter. I believe he probably did, because if he would have said, hey, I'm not a good communicator, I stumble. This is what he says. Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. I believe if he didn't have a speech impediment, that God would have stopped him right there and said, liar, liar, pants on fire. But he doesn't say that. He lets him go on and say, what he's going to say. He says, I'm not a good communicator. They're not going to listen to me because I don't speak well. And his last objection is he just blatantly says, I can't do it. I can't do it. I tried it before. It didn't work. I can't do this. But Moses said, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. God comes to Moses and says, listen, you know that you were designed for this. You know, because you tried it already. You know that I've called you to do this, and here I am calling you to do this. Go do it. And Moses' response is, no, I'm afraid. I'm a nobody. I don't speak very well. They're not going to listen to me. Please, send somebody else. See, Moses' problem was that Moses doubted Moses. He didn't doubt God. He doubted himself. He doubted that he had what it took to do what God was asking him to do. We doubt ourselves all the time. I recently started officiating football. And I love officiating football and have had a blast doing it. And so I decided that now that football season is over, I did my last game of the season yesterday. Now that football season is over, I'm like, hey, let's do basketball because nobody ever yells at basketball officials, so that's going to be great. And so I've ordered the books. I'm going to study up so that I can take the test and do all that stuff. And it's funny that I don't have the books yet. I haven't been able to look at it to take the test to get it, because you only get one shot to take the officiating test per year. And we're going, when we get done here, we're going to go to the mall, because Sunday lunch is best when somebody else cooks it. So, we're going to Red Robin, and while we're at the mall, we're going to go look at basketball shoes, because I got to get basketball shoes if I'm going to ref basketball. And that thought keeps coming in the back of my head. You're going to go spend money on basketball shoes that you don't have, and you haven't taken the test yet. What happens if you fail the test? You're going to have a pair of shoes that you can't wear for absolutely no reason. That's funny, I'm sitting here saying this, and I'm purposely not looking at Jennifer, because she's probably rolling her eyes at me, because when I took the football test, I passed it on the first try. But I'm not looking at God in this situation. I'm looking at me. I'm looking at me and saying, man, I don't know if I want to step out and do that. See, Moses doubted Moses. We need to understand biblical courage when we're called to do something biblical. Biblical courage says, I can't, but God can. What does David say? When he goes up against Goliath, does David say, listen, I killed the lion and I killed the bear, now I'm going to go kill Goliath? No, David says, through me, God killed the lion and God killed the bear, now God's going to go kill Goliath through me. What does Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say when they're standing at the fiery furnace and Nebuchadnezzar says, bow down to this big, huge golden statue that I've set up. Bow down to it, or I'm going to throw you into the furnace where even your God can't save you. And I love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response. We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. That's biblical courage. Biblical courage is God will. I can't, but God will. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had zero confidence that they could walk into the fiery furnace and walk back out without God. They had 100% complete confidence that if they were thrown into the fiery furnace, that God would save them. And even if he didn't, they didn't care. They weren't going to do the bad thing that they were being asked to do. That is biblical courage. Biblical courage is trusting in God completely. So what does God say to Moses when Moses comes to him and says, I can't? God says, I am with you. He literally says in chapter 3, verse 12, I will be with you. How often are we called to do something? We're called into a situation and we're like, I can't do this. And God's like, you're right, you can't, but I can, and I'm going to be with you. What's that scary thing that we want to do? And God says, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it through you. The second courage aid that God gives Moses, he says, listen, I am bigger than all of your obstacles. I'm bigger than everything that you are afraid of. Remember that Moses said that he was a little tongue-tied, and he didn't know if people were going to be able to listen to him. And he said, look, all these obstacles, all these things that are going to keep me from doing what you want me to do. And this is what God says, I am who I am. That is what you say to the Israelites, I am has sent you. What God is saying is, listen, I'm the God that was. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the God that's having a conversation with you right now. And I'm the God that's going to lead you out and continue on forever. What obstacle can we come up with that is going to compare to a God that has existed for all time? What obstacle can we come up with that God doesn't say, I got this, I can handle this? We look at obstacles from our vantage point and they are huge. God looks at obstacles from his vantage point and they're nothing. The third courage aid that God gives to Moses, he says, I have everything you need. Trust me. Remember that Moses was looking at Moses and saying, listen, I can't do it. God never says, yes, you can. God says, I can, and I'm going to do it through you. God says, listen, I've got everything you need. You just need to trust in me. You're right, you can't. I can. The Lord said to him, what's in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord says, throw it on the ground. When he picks up the staff, when he throws it on the ground, it turns into a snake. When he picks it up, it turns back into a staff. That would be a pretty good indication for me that God is on my side, is going to do some awesome things. I mean, if you're taking your walking stick and you throw it on the ground and all of a sudden it starts to slither off, and then you walk over to pick it back up and it turns back into a staff, I think that's a pretty good indication that God's on your side. God says, listen, take your hand and stick it in your cloak. When he pulls it out, it's leprous. When he puts it back in and pulls it back out again, everything is perfectly fine. Pretty good indication that God is calling you and telling you what to do when he gives you miraculous signs like this. When it comes to Moses' response that he's not a good communicator, I love God's response. He says, who gave human beings their mouth? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. God says, listen, I'm the one that makes you mute. I'm the one that makes you deaf. I'm the one that makes you blind. I'm the one that's going to give you the power to do all this. You say, I can't speak well. And God says, but I can, and I'm going to give you what to say. He also says, what about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well, and he is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. Notice that God already has a solution to Moses' problem. Moses says, I don't communicate very well. And God acknowledges that and says, hey, but your cousin Aaron does. And he is already on his way. I told you I wanted you to do this, and I've already answered all of your objections. Our job is to trust. Our job is to, when God comes to us and says, hey, I got something I want you to do, our job is to do it. I was, many years ago, I was working for the company that grades the standardized tests that you have to take in schools. I think it's called iLearn today. It used to be called iStep. But I worked for the company that would grade those tests. And I sat at a computer for all day, and the guy that sat across from me at the other computer grading tests, he and I would have conversations while we were grading tests because it is mind-numbingly boring grading those tests for 8 hours a day. If you think it's difficult to take those tests, try reading your responses to them for 8 hours at a day. So we would have a lot of really good conversations, and through our conversations, it became very clear to me that the man I was talking to was not a Christian, was very anti-Christian. And I can remember it was my last day working with him. And we sat down that morning and we started working, and God started talking to me as I'm grading these tests. And God says, hey, this is your last day working with him. You need to talk to him about me. I said, but God, he doesn't like you. And God said, I know, but he likes you, and I want you to talk to him about me. I said, but God, that's going to be an awkward conversation. I really don't want to have it. And God said, I don't care. I'm asking you to have this conversation. I'm not asking you to have this conversation. I'm telling you to have this conversation. For the next 2 hours, I spent arguing with God on why I should not have this conversation with this guy. And of course, God won the argument, and I looked up at my friend and I said, hey, what are you doing for lunch today? Because he normally would leave to go to lunch. But of course, not on this day. This day, he was staying. He had brought his lunch, and he was going to sit in the cafeteria and eat it. And I said, oh, okay. He goes, why'd you ask? And I said, I just wanted to talk to you about something. And he said, okay, well, we're all going to go sit in the cafeteria together and we can have this conversation. And I'm like, great, God. So instead of it being a one-on-one conversation, now it's a one-on-5 conversation. Thanks. So we go to lunch, and we had a conversation. It was a very civil and good conversation. He had some great questions and some well-thought-out objections. I did my best to answer them. And we parted as friends. To this day, I don't know how that conversation ended up happening with him. I haven't talked to him since then. I don't know how God used that conversation, but I know that God was telling me to shut up and have that conversation. That God was telling me, I don't care what your objections are. Go talk to him. What is it that God is asking you to do? That you keep having that conversation with God and saying, but God, I don't really want to do this. You see, we read earlier that God, when Moses was at the burning bush, he was on Mount Horeb, that they called the mountain of God. Because it was well known that God spent a lot of time on that mountain. I don't believe that this is the first time that Moses was on Mount Horeb. I believe he probably knew the area very well. I believe he'd probably done a lot of praying as he was going around that mountain. I believe he spent a lot of time going to God and saying, God, you asked me to do this. I believe that you put me in position to lead my people out of Israel. Why didn't it work? I believe he'd had lots of conversations with God there. And it's really interesting when we look at Mount Horeb that Moses has a conversation with God at Mount Horeb through the burning bush. Then later, Moses brings the people out of Egypt, and they stop at Mount Horeb, and this is where Moses goes up and gets the 10 Commandments. This is the same mountain where when Elijah gets frustrated and is scared to death, that he goes to this mountain and cries out to the Lord and says, God, listen, everybody has bowed their knee to Baal. I'm the only one who hasn't done it, and they're trying to kill me. It's the same exact mountain where God comes to him and says, man, it's okay. I'm with you. And there's 7,000 other people who haven't done that, so I'm with you. This is the same mountain that when Jesus wants to show some of his disciples his power, this is the mountain that the transfiguration happens, where a couple of guys get to go up on the mountain with Jesus and they get to see Elijah and Moses. This is that mountain, and I think Moses knew this mountain because Moses had spent a lot of time talking to God there. What is it that you've been spending a lot of time talking to God about? What is that conversation, that job that God is telling you to take, that thing that God is asking you to give up? What is it that God has laid on your heart through continual conversation that you keep coming back to God and saying, no, I really don't think so? God is calling us to do some awesome and amazing things. And here's the thing. We look at those things and say, I can't do it. I can't do the things that I'm being asked to do. But God can. Jennifer and I went to a conference a couple weeks ago. And at this conference, we were asked, one of the things that I was going to, we were asked to come up with big, hairy, audacious goals. They're called BHAGs. That I had to come up with some big, hairy, audacious goals. And so I sat down and I prayed about it, and I came up with a big, hairy, audacious goal, and I went to God, and I said, God, here's my big, hairy, audacious goal. And God said, that's not big, hairy, and audacious enough for me. I said, but God, I think I don't think you understand how much this goal scares me. And God said, I don't think you understand how much I don't care whether you're scared. I don't think you understand how powerful I am. So what I want you to do is I want you to double it. I said, God, are you sure about that? He said, yes. So I came up with 3 big, hairy, audacious goals that, I'm not going to lie to you, scare me. So the youth ministry at ECC, by 2030, the youth ministry here at ECC is going to baptize 100 new believers. And that scares the snot out of me because I've been here for 7 years and I think we've maybe like 12 or 15 baptisms. So in 7 years, I've done 15 baptisms, and now in 6.5 years, you're asking me to do 100 baptisms. God, that's not possible. And God said, you know what? You're right. You can't do it, Matt, but I can. So do it. By 2030, the youth ministry is also going to have 50 youth that love Jesus so much they can't help but talking about it to their friends and teaching their friends about Jesus. And then by 2030, we're going to have 10 kids that graduate from ECC that want to go into full-time ministry. Those goals scare the snot out of me. They scare me because what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if I do something, because I do stupid stuff all the time? What happens if I pull a Moses and I go kill the Egyptian because I think it's what God wants me to do? Because guess what? I've killed an Egyptian in my time. I did something stupid and I pushed and it didn't work. And now I'm being asked to step out on faith and to do something awesome and audacious, and it's the exact same thing, but I believe God is calling me to do it this time, and I am terrified. And God keeps saying, it's not you, it's me. What is it that God is asking you to do? Because we've got to remember, just like when Moses brought the message to the people, this is, what am I supposed to call you? What am I supposed to call you? And he says, listen, I am. We serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We serve the God today that is still living and doing and working. And we serve the God that is going to continue to live and do and work after we are gone. We serve an eternal God. We have to, with faith, step out and follow where he's leading. I don't know what it is in your life that God is asking you to do. I don't know. I have a feeling you probably do. My prayer is that as we leave today, that you're listening to the call of God and not the fear in our own hearts. Please pray with me. Dear God, I'm not going to lie. Sometimes it's scary to follow you. Sometimes it's scary to do the things that you call us to do. But you've called us to do some amazing things for your glory, not ours. I pray that you be with us all right now as we concentrate on your word, as we worship you, that we remember that you are the God who was, the God who is, and the God who is to come. That you have always been our God, and you always will be our God. We thank you. Thank you for the power that you display through us and our weakness. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.